Chapter 13, Part 1 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 13. From now on, Fanny Brandeis's life became such a swift-flowing thing that your trilogist would have regarded her with disgust. Here was no slow unfolding, petal by petal. Here were two processes going on side by side. Fanny, the woman of business, flourished and throve like a weed, arrogantly flaunting its head above the timid white flower that lay close to the soil and crept and spread and multiplied. Between the two, the fight went on silently. Fate or chance, or whatever it is that directs our movements, was forever throwing tragic or comic little life groups in her path, and then pointing an arresting finger at her, implying, "This means you." Fanny stepped over those obstructions, or walked around them, or stared straight through them. She had told herself that she would observe the first anniversary of her mother's death with none of those ancient customs by which your pious Jew honors his dead. There would be no Yahrzeit light burning for 24 hours. She would not go to temple for Kaddish prayer. But the thing was too strong for her, too anciently inbred. Her ancestors would have lighted a candle, or an oil lamp. Fanny, coming home at 6, found herself turning on the shaded electric lamp in her hall. She went through to the kitchen. "Princess, when you come in tomorrow morning, you'll find a light in the hall. Don't turn it off until tomorrow evening at 6. "All day long, Miss Fan? My sakes, what for?" "It's just a religious custom." "Didn't know yo' had no religion, Miss Fan. Leastways, I never could figure." "I haven't," said Fanny shortly. "Dinner ready soon, Princess? I'm starved." She had entered a Jewish house of worship only once in this year. It was the stately, white-columned edifice on Grand Boulevard that housed the congregation presided over by the famous Kirsch. She had heard of him, naturally. She was there out of curiosity, like any other newcomer to Chicago. The beauty of the auditorium enchanted her. A magnificently proportioned room, and restful without being in the least gloomy. Then she had been interested in the congregation as it rustled in. She thought she had never seen so many modishly gowned women in one room in all her life. The men were sleekly broadclothed, but they lacked the well-dressed air somehow. The women were slimly elegant in tailored suits and furs. They all looked as if they had been turned out by the same tailor. An artist in his line, but of limited imagination. Dr. Kirsch, sociologist and savant, aquiline, semi-bald, grimly satiric, sat in his splendid high-backed chair, surveying his silken flock through half-closed lids. He looked tired and rather ill, Fanny thought, but distinctly a personage. She wondered if he held them or they him. That recalled to her the little Winnebago Temple and Rabbi Thalmann. She remembered the frequent rudeness and open inattention of that congregation. No doubt Mrs. Nathan Pereles had her counterpart here, and the hypocritical Bella Weinberg, too, and the giggling Aarons girls and old Ben Reitman. Here Dr. Kirsch had risen, and coming forward, had paused to lean over his desk and, with an awful geniality, had looked down upon two rustling, exquisitely gowned latecomers. They sank into their seats, cowed. Fanny grinned. He began his lecture, something about modern politics. Fanny was fascinated and resentful by turns. His brilliant satire probed, cut, jabbed like a surgeon's scalpel, or he railed, scolded, snarled like a dyspeptic schoolmaster. Often he was in wretched taste. He mimicked, postured, sneered. But he had this millionaire congregation of his in hand. Fanny found herself smiling up at him delightedly. Perhaps this wasn't religion, as she had been taught to look upon it, but it certainly was tonic. She told herself that she would have come to the same conclusion if Kirsch had occupied a Methodist pulpit. There were no Kaddish prayers in Kirsch's temple. On the Friday following the first anniversary of Molly Brandeis's death, Fanny did not go home after working hours, but took a bite of supper in a neighborhood restaurant. Then she found her way to one of the Orthodox Russian Jewish synagogues on the west side. It was a dim, odorous, bare little place, this house of worship. Fanny had never seen one like it before. She was herded up into the gallery where the women sat, and when the patriarchal rabbi began to intone the prayer for the dead, Fanny threw the gallery into wide panic by rising for it, a thing that no woman is allowed to do in an Orthodox Jewish church. She stood calmly, though the beshawled woman to right and left of her yanked at her coat. In January, Fanny discovered New York. She went as selector for her department. Hereafter Slosson would only do the actual buying. Styles, prices, and materials would be decided by her. Ella Monahan accompanied her, it being the time for her monthly trip. Fanny openly envied her her knowledge of New York's wholesale district. Ella offered to help. "No," Fanny had replied, "I think not, thanks. You've your own work, and besides, I know pretty well what I want, and where to go to get it. It's making them give it to me that will be hard." They went to the same hotel, and took connecting rooms. Each went her own way, not seeing the other from morning until night, but they often found kimonoed comfort in each other's presence. Fanny had spent weeks outlining her plan of attack. She had determined to retain the cheap grades, but to add a finer line as well. She recalled those lace-bedecked bundles that the farmer women and mill hands had borne so tenderly in their arms. Here was one direction in which they allowed extravagance free rein. As a canny businesswoman, she would trade on her knowledge of their weakness. A Haynes Cooper order is never a thing to be despised by a wholesaler. Fanny, knowing this, had made up her mind to go straight to Horn & Udell. Now Horn & Udell are responsible for the bloomers your small daughter wears under her play frock, in place of the troublesome and extravagant petticoat of the old days. It was they who introduced smocked pinafores to you, and those modish patent leather belts for children at which your grandmothers would have raised horrified hands. They taught you that an inch of hand embroidery is worth a yard of cheap lace, and as for style, cut, line, you can tell a Horn & Udell child from among a flock of 30. Fanny, entering their office, felt much as Molly Brandeis had felt that January many, many years before, when she had made that first terrifying trip to the Chicago market. The engagement had been made days before. Fanny never knew the shock that her youthful, expectant face gave old Sid Udell. He turned from his desk to greet her, his polite smile of greeting giving way to a look of bewilderment. "But you are not the buyer, are you, Miss Brandeis?" "No, Mr. Slosson buys." "I thought so." "But I select for my entire department. I decide on our styles, materials, and prices, 6 months in advance. Then Mr. Slosson does the actual bulk buying." "Something newfangled?" inquired Sid Udell. "Of course we've never sold much to you people. Our stuff is—" "Yes, I know. But you'd like to, wouldn't you?" "Our class of goods isn't exactly suited to your wants." "Yes, it is, exactly. That's why I'm here. We'll be doing a business of $1.25 million in my department in another 2 years. No firm, not even Horn & Udell, can afford to ignore an account like that." Sid Udell smiled a little. "You've made up your mind to that $1.25 million, young lady?" "Yes." "Well, I've dealt with buyers for a quarter of a century or more, and I'd say that you're going to get it." Whereupon Fanny began to talk. 10 minutes later Udell interrupted her to summon Horn, whose domain was the factory. Horn came, was introduced, looked doubtful. Fanny had statistics. Fanny had arguments. She had determination. "And what we want," she went on in her quiet, assured way, "is style. The Horn & Udell clothes have chic. Now material can't be imitated successfully, but style can. Our goods lack just that. I could copy any model you have, turn the idea over to a cheap manufacturer, and get $1 million just like it at 1/5 the price. That isn't a threat. It's just a business statement that you know to be true. I can sketch from memory anything I've seen once. What I want to know is this. Will you make it necessary for me to do that, or will you undertake to furnish us with cheaper copies of your high-priced designs? We could use your entire output. I know the small-town woman of the poorer class, and I know she'll wear a shawl in order to give her child a cloth coat with fancy buttons and a velvet collar." And Horn & Udell, whose attitude at first had been that of 2 seasoned business men dealing with a precocious child, found themselves quoting prices to her, shipments, materials, quality, quantities. Then came the question of time. "We'll get out a special catalog for the summer," Fanny said. "A small one to start them our way. Then the big fall catalog will contain the entire line." "That doesn't give us time!" exclaimed both men in a breath. "But you must manage somehow. Can't you speed up the workroom? Put on extra hands? It's worth it." They might, under normal conditions. But there was this strike talk, its ugly head bobbing up in 100 places, and their goods were the kind that required high-class workers. Their girls earned all the way from $12 to $25. But Fanny knew she had driven home the entering wedge. She left them after making an engagement for the following day. The Horn and Udell factory was in New York's newer loft building section, around Madison, Fifth Avenue, and the 30s. Her hotel was very near. She walked up Fifth Avenue a little way, and as she walked she wondered why she did not feel more elated. Her day's work had exceeded her expectations. It was a brilliant January afternoon, with a snap in the air that was almost Western. Fifth Avenue flowed up, flowed down, and Fanny fought the impulse to stare after every second or third woman she passed. They were so invariably well dressed. There was none of the occasional shabbiness or dowdiness of Michigan Avenue. Every woman seemed to have emerged fresh from the hands of masseuse and maid. Their hair was coiffed to suit the angle of the hat, and the hat had been chosen to enhance the contour of the head, and the head was carried with regard for the dark furs that encircled the throat. They were amazingly well shod. Their white gloves were white, a fact remarkable to any soot-haunted Chicagoan. Their coloring rivaled the rose leaf, and nobody's nose was red. "Goodness knows I've never pretended to be a beauty," Fanny said that evening, in conversation with Ella Monahan. "But I've always thought I had my good points. By the time I'd reached 42nd Street I wouldn't have given 2 cents for my chances of winning a caveman on a desert island." She made up her mind that she would go back to the hotel, get a thick coat, and ride outside one of those fascinating Fifth Avenue buses. It struck her as an ideal way to see this amazing street. She was back at her hotel in 10 minutes. Ella had not yet come in. Their rooms were on the 10th floor. Fanny got her coat, peered at her own reflection in the mirror, sighed, shook her head, and was off down the hall toward the elevators. The great hall window looked toward Fifth Avenue, but between it and the avenue rose a yellow brick building that housed tier on tier of manufacturing lofts. Cloaks, suits, blouses, petticoats, hats, dresses. It was just such a building as Fanny had come from when she had left the offices of Horn and Udell. It might be their very building, for all she knew. She looked straight into its windows as she stood waiting for the lift, and window after window showed women sewing. They were sewing at machines and at handwork, but not as women are accustomed to sew, with leisurely stitches, stopping to pat a seam here, to run a calculating eye along a hem or ruffle. It was dreadful mechanical motion, that sewing, a machine-like relentless motion, with no waste in it, no pause. Fanny's mind leaped back to Winnebago, with its pleasant porches on which leisurely women sat stitching peacefully at a fine seam. What was it she had said to Udell? "Can't you speed up the workroom? It's worth it." Fanny turned abruptly from the window as the door of the bronze and mirrored lift opened for her. She walked over to Fifth Avenue again and up to 45th Street. Then she scrambled up the spiral stairs of a Washington Square bus. The air was crisp, clear, intoxicating. To her Chicago eyes, the buildings, the streets, the very sky looked startlingly fresh and new-washed. As the bus lurched down Fifth Avenue, she leaned over the railing to stare, fascinated, at the colorful, shifting, brilliant panorama of the most amazing street in the world. Block after block, as far as the eye could see, the gorgeous procession moved up, moved down, and the great, gleaming motor cars crept, and crawled, and writhed in and out, like nothing so much as swollen angleworms in a fishing can, Fanny thought. Her eye was caught by one limousine that stood out, even in that crush of magnificence. It was all black, as though scorning to attract the eye with vulgar color, and it was lined with white. Fanny thought it looked very much like Siegel and Cohen's hearse back in Winnebago. In it sat a woman, all furs and orchids and complexion. She was holding up to the window a little dog with a wrinkled and weary face, like that of an old, old man. He was sticking his little evil, eager red tongue out at the world. And he wore a very smart and woolly white sweater, of the imported kind, with a monogram done in black. The traffic policeman put up his hand. The bus rumbled on down the street. Names that had always been remotely mythical to her now met her eye and became realities. Maillard's, and that great red stone castle was the Waldorf, almost historic, and it looked newer than the smoke-grimed Blackstone. And straight ahead, why, that must be the Flatiron Building. It loomed up like the giant prow of an unimaginable ship. Brentano's, the Holland House, Madison Square. Why, there never was anything so terrifying and beautiful and palpitating and exquisite as this Fifth Avenue in the late winter afternoon, with the sky ahead a rosy mist, and the golden lights just beginning to spangle the gray. At Madison Square she decided to walk. She negotiated the bus steps with surprising skill for a novice, and scurried along the perilous crossing to the opposite side. She entered Madison Square. But why hadn't O. Henry emphasized its beauty instead of its squalor? It lay, a purple pool of shadow, surrounded by the great, gleaming, many-windowed office buildings, like an amethyst sunk in a circle of diamonds. "It's a fairyland," Fanny told herself. "Who'd have thought a city could be so beautiful?" And then at her elbow a voice said, "Oh, lady, for the love of God!" She turned with a jerk, and looked up into the unshaven face of a great, blue-eyed giant who pulled off his cap and stood twisting it in his swollen blue fingers. "Lady, I'm cold. I'm hungry. I've been sitting here hours." Fanny clutched her bag a little fearfully. She looked at his huge frame. "Why don't you work?" "Work?" He laughed. "There ain't any. Look at this." He turned up his foot, and you saw the bare sole, blackened and horrible, and fringed comically by the tattered leather upper. "Oh, my dear!" said Fanny, and at that the man began to cry, weakly, sickeningly, like a little boy. "Don't do that! Don't! Here!" She was emptying her purse, and something inside her was saying, "You fool! He's only a professional beggar." And then the man wiped his face with his cap, and swallowed hard, and said, "I don't want all you got. I ain't holding you up. Just give me that. I've been sitting here on that bench, looking at that sign across the street. Over there. It says, 'Eat.' It goes off and on, seeming like it was driving me crazy." Fanny thrust a crumpled $5 bill into his hand, and was off. She fairly flew along, so that it was not until she had reached 33rd Street that she said aloud, as was her way when moved, "I don't care. Don't blame me. It was that miserable little beast of a dog in the white sweater that did it." It was almost 7 when she reached her room. A maid in neat black and white was just coming out with an armful of towels. "I just brought you a couple of extra towels. We were short this morning," she said. The room was warm and quiet and bright. In her bathroom, that glistened with blue and white tiling, were those redundant towels. Fanny stood in the doorway and counted them whimsically. 4 great fuzzy bath towels, 8 glistening hand towels. A blue and white bath rug hung at the side of the tub. Her telephone rang. It was Ella. "Where in the world have you been, child? I was worried about you. I thought you were lost in the streets of New York." "I took a bus ride," Fanny explained. "See anything of New York?" "I saw all of it," replied Fanny. Ella laughed at that, but Fanny's face was serious. "How did you make out at Horn & Udell's? Never mind, I'm coming in for a minute. Can I?" "Please do. I need you." A moment later Ella bounced in, fresh as to blouse, pink as to cheeks, her whole appearance a testimony to the revivifying effects of a warm bath, a brief nap, clean clothes. "Dear child, you look tired. I'm not going to stay. You get dressed and I'll meet you for dinner. Or do you want yours up here?" "Oh, no." "Phone me when you're dressed. But tell me, isn't it a wonder, this town? I'll never forget my first trip here. I spent one whole evening standing in front of the mirror, trying to make those little spit curls the women were wearing then. I'd seen 'em on Fifth Avenue, and it seemed I'd die if I couldn't have 'em too, and I dabbed on rouge and touched up my eyebrows. I don't know. It's a kind of crazy feeling gets you. The minute I got on the train for Chicago I washed my face and took my hair down and did it plain again." "Why, that's the way I felt," laughed Fanny. "I didn't care anything about infants' wear, or Haynes Cooper, or anything. I just wanted to be beautiful, as they all were. Sure, it gets us all." Fanny twisted her hair into the relentless knob women assumed preparatory to bathing. "It seems to me you have to come from Winnebago or thereabouts to get New York. Really get it, I mean." "That's so," agreed Ella. "There's a man on the New York Star who writes a column every day that everybody reads. If he isn't a small town man, then we're both wrong." Fanny, bath-bound, turned to stare at Ella. "A column about what?" "Oh, everything. New York, mostly. Says it's the humanest stuff. He says the kind of thing we'd all say, if we knew how. Reading him is like getting a letter from home. I'll bet he went to a country school and wore his mittens sewed to a piece of tape that ran through his coat sleeves." "You're right," said Fanny. "He did. That man's from Winnebago, Wisconsin." "No!" "Yes." "Do you mean you know him? Honestly? What's he like?" But Fanny had vanished. "I'm a tired business woman," she called back, above the splashing that followed, "and I won't converse until I'm fed." "But how about Horn & Udell?" demanded Ella, her mouth against the crack. "Practically mine," boasted Fanny. "You mean landed?" "Well, hooked, at any rate, and putting up a very poor struggle." "Why, you clever little devil, you! You'll be making me look like a stock girl next." Fanny did not telephone Heyl until the day she left New York. She had told herself she would not telephone him at all. He had sent her his New York address and telephone number months before, after that Sunday at the dunes. Ella Monahan had finished her work and had gone back to Chicago 4 days before Fanny was ready to leave. In those 4 days Fanny had scoured the city from the Palisades to Pell Street. I don't know how she found her way about. It was sort of instinct with her. She seemed to scent the picturesque. She never for a moment neglected her work. But she had found it was often impossible to see these New York business men until 10, sometimes 11, o'clock. She awoke at 7, a habit formed in her Winnebago days. 8:30 one morning found her staring up at the dim vastness of the dome of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. The great gray pile, mountainous, almost ominous, looms up in the midst of the dingy commonplaceness of Amsterdam Avenue and 110th Street. New Yorkers do not know this, or if they know it, the fact does not interest them. New Yorkers do not go to stare up into the murky shadows of this glorious edifice. They would if it were situate in Rome. Bare, crude, unfinished, chaotic, it gives rich promise of magnificent fulfillment. In an age when great structures are thrown up today, to be torn down tomorrow, this slow-moving giant is at once a reproach and an example. 25 years in building, 25 more for completion, it has elbowed its way, stone by stone, into such company as St. Peter's at Rome and the Marvel at Milan. Fanny found her way down the crude cinder paths that made an alley-like approach to the cathedral. She entered at the side door that one found by following arrows posted on the rough wooden fence. Once inside, she stood a moment, awed by the immensity of the half-finished nave. As she stood there, hands clasped, her face turned raptly up to where the massive granite columns reared their height to frame the choir, she was, for the moment, as devout as any Episcopalian whose money had helped make the great building. Not only devout, but prayerful, ecstatic. That was partly due to the effect of the pillars, the lights, the tapestries, the great unfinished chunks of stone that loomed out from the side walls, and the purple shadow cast by the window above the chapels at the far end, and partly to the actress in her that responded magically to any mood and always to surroundings. Later she walked softly down the deserted nave, past the choir, to the cluster of chapels, set like gems at one end, and running from north to south in a semicircle. A placard outside one said, "St. Saviour's Chapel, for those who wish to rest and pray." All white marble, this little nook, gleaming softly in the gray half-light. Fanny entered and sat down. She was quite alone. The roar and crash of the 8th Avenue L, the Amsterdam cars, the motors drumming up Morningside Hill were softened here to a soothing hum. For those who wish to rest and pray. Fanny Brandeis had neither rested nor prayed since that hideous day when she had hurled her prayer of defiance at him. But something within her now began a groping for words that should follow an ancient plea beginning, "O God of my fathers." But at that the picture of the room came back to her mental vision. The room so quiet except for the breathing of the woman on the bed, the woman with the tolerant, humorous mouth, and the straight, clever nose, and the softly bright brown eyes, all so strangely pinched and shrunken-looking now. Fanny got to her feet with a noisy scraping of the chair on the stone floor. The vague, half-formed prayer died at birth. She found her way out of the dim, quiet little chapel, up the long aisle, and out the great door. She shivered a little in the cold of the early January morning as she hurried toward the Broadway subway. At 9:30 she was standing at a counter in the infants' wear section at Beth's, making mental notes while the unsuspecting saleswoman showed her how the pink ribbon in this year's models was brought under the beading, French fashion, instead of weaving through it as heretofore. At 10:30 she was saying to Sid Udell, "I think a written contract is always best. Then we'll all know just where we stand. Mr. Fenger will be out next week to arrange the details, but just now a very brief written understanding to show him on my return would do." And she got it, and tucked it away in her bag in triumph. She tried to leave New York without talking to Heyl, but some quiet, insistent force impelled her to act contrary to her resolution. It was, after all, the urge of the stronger wish against the weaker. When he heard her voice over the telephone, Heyl did not say, "Who is this?" Neither did he put those inevitable questions of the dweller to the transient. "Where are you? How long have you been here?" What he said was, "How are you going to avoid dining with me tonight?" To which Fanny replied promptly, "By taking the 20th Century back to Chicago today." A little silence, a hurt silence. Then, "When they get the 20th Century habit they're as good as lost. How's the infants' wear business, Fanny?" "Booming, thank you. I want to tell you I've read the column every day. It's wonderful stuff." "It's a wonderful job. I'm a lucky boy. I'm doing the thing I'd rather do than anything else in the world. There are mighty few who can say that." There was another silence, awkward, heavy. Then, "Fanny, you're not really leaving today." "I'll be in Chicago tomorrow, barring wrecks." "You might have let me show you our more or less fair city." "I've shown it to myself. I've seen Riverside Drive at sunset and at night. That alone would have been enough. But I've seen Fulton Market, too, and the Grand Street stalls, and Washington Square, and Central Park, and Lady Duff Gordon's inner showroom, and the Night Court, and the Grand Central Subway horror at 6 p.m., and the gambling on the curb, and the bench sleepers in Madison Square. Oh, Clancy, the misery!" "Hey, wait a minute. All this alone?" "Yes. And one more thing. I've landed Horn & Udell, which means nothing to you, but to me it means that by spring my department will be a credit to its stepmother, a real success." "I knew it would be a success. So did you. Anything you might attempt would be successful. You'd have made a successful lawyer, or cook, or actress, or hydraulic engineer, because you couldn't do a thing badly. It isn't in you. You're a superlative sort of person. But that's no reason for being any of those things. If you won't admit a debt to humanity, surely you'll acknowledge you've an obligation to yourself." "Preaching again. Good by." "Fanny, you're afraid to see me." "Don't be ridiculous. Why should I be?" "Because I say out loud the things you daren't let yourself think. If I were to promise not to talk about anything but flannel bands—" "Will you promise?" "No. But I'm going to meet you at the clock at the Grand Central Station 15 minutes before train time. I don't care if every infants' wear manufacturer in New York had a prior claim on your time. You may as well be there, because if you're not, I'll get on the train and stay on as far as Albany. Take your choice." He was there before her. Fanny, following the wake of a red cap, picked him at once from among the crowd of clock waiters. He saw her at the same time, and started forward with that singularly lithe, springy step which was, after all, just the result of perfectly trained muscles in coordination. He was wearing New York clothes, the right kind, Fanny noted. Their hands met. "How well you look," said Fanny, rather lamely. "It's the clothes," said Hale, and began to revolve slowly, coyly, hands out, palms down, eyelids drooping, in delicious imitation of those ladies whose business it is to revolve thus for fashion. "Clancy, you idiot! All these people! Stop it!" "But get the grace. Get the easy English hang, at once so loose and so clinging." Fanny grinned appreciatively, and led the way through the gate to the train. She was surprisingly glad to be with him again. On discovering that, she began to talk rapidly, and about him. "Tell me, how do you manage to keep that fresh viewpoint? Everybody else who comes to New York to write loses his identity. The city swallows him up. I mean by that things seem to strike you as freshly as they did when you first came. I remember you wrote me an amazing letter." "For one thing, I've never been anything but a foreigner in New York. I'll never quite believe Broadway. I'll never cease to marvel at Fifth Avenue and Cooper Union and the Bronx. The time may come when I can take the subway for granted, but don't ask it of me just yet." "But the other writers, and all those people who live down in Washington Square?" "I never see them. It's sure death. Those Greenwichers are always taking out their own feelings and analyzing them, and pawing them over and passing them around. When they get through with them they're so thumb-marked and greasy that no one else wants them. They don't get enough golf, those Greenwichers. They don't get enough tennis. They don't get enough walking in the open spaces. Gosh, no! I know better than to fall for that kind of thing. They spend hours talking to each other in dim-lighted attics about souls and society and the joy of life and the greater good, and they know all about each other's insides. They talk themselves out, and there's nothing left to write about. A little of that kind of thing purges and cleanses. Too much of it poisons and clogs. No, ma'am. When I want to talk I go down and chin with the foreman of our composing room. There's a chap that has what I call conversation. A philosopher, and knows everything in the world. Composing room foremen always are, and do. Now that's all of that. How about Fanny Brandeis? Any sketches? Come on, confess. Grand Street, anyway." "I haven't touched a pencil except to add up a column of figures or copy an order since last September, when you were so sure I couldn't stop." "You've done 1,000 in your head. And if you haven't done one on paper, so much the better. You'll jam them back and stifle them, and screw the cover down tight on every natural impulse, and then, some day, the cover will blow off with a loud report. You can't kill that kind of thing, Fanny. It would have to be a wholesale massacre of all the centuries behind you. I don't so much mind your being disloyal to your tribe, or race, or whatever you want to call it. But you've turned your back on yourself. You've got an obligation to humanity, and I'll nag you till you pay it. I don't care if I lose you, so long as you find yourself. The thing you've got isn't merely racial. God, no. It's universal. And you owe it to the world. Pay up, Fanny. Pay up. Look here, began Fanny, her voice low with anger. The last time I saw you, I said I'd never again put myself in a position to be lectured by you like a schoolgirl. I mean it, this time. If you have anything else to say to me, say it now. The train leaves, she glanced at her wrist, in 2 minutes, thank heaven, and this will be your last chance. All right, said Hale. I've got something to say. Do you wear hatpins? Hatpins? Blankly. Not with this small hat, but what? That means you're defenseless. If you're going to prowl the streets of Chicago alone, get this. If you double your fist this way and tuck your thumb alongside like that, and aim for this spot right here, about 2 inches this side of the chin, bringing your arm back and up quickly like a piston, the person you hit will go down, limp. There's a nerve right there that communicates with the brain. That blow makes you see stars, bright lights, and fancy colors. They use it in the comic papers. You are crazy, said Fanny, as though at last assured of a long-suspected truth. The train began to move almost imperceptibly. Run! She cried. Hale sped up the aisle. At the door he turned. It's called an uppercut, he shouted to the amazement of the other passengers, and leaped from the train. Fanny sank into her seat, weakly. Then she began to laugh, and there was a dash of hysteria in it. He had left a paper on the car seat. It was the Star. Fanny crumpled it childishly and kicked it under the seat. She took off her hat, arranged her belongings, and sat back with eyes closed. After a few minutes she opened them, fished about under the seat for the crumpled copy of the Star, and read it, turning at once to his column. She thought it was a very unpretentious thing, that column, and yet so full of insight and sagacity and whimsical humor. Not a guffaw in it, but a smile in every 5th line. She wondered if those years of illness and loneliness, with weeks of reading and tramping and climbing in the Colorado mountains, had kept him strangely young, or made him strangely old. She welcomed the hours that lay between New York and Chicago. They would give her an opportunity to digest the events of the past 10 days. In her systematic mind she began to range them in the order of their importance. Horn and Udell came first, of course, and then the line of maternity dresses she had selected to take the place of the hideous models carried under Slosson's regime, and then the slip-over pinafores. But somehow her thoughts became jumbled here, so that faces instead of garments filled her mind's eye. Again and again there swam into her ken the face of that woman of 50, in decent widow's weeds, who had stood there in the night court, charged with drunkenness on the streets, and the man with the frostbitten fingers in Madison Square, and the dog in the sweater, and the feverish concentration of the piecework sewers in the window of the loft building. She gave it up, selected a magazine, and decided to go in to lunch. End of Part 1 of Chapter 13.